Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to the first lecture on biodiversity. So, before studying the biodiversity, in the last lectures, we get to know what is an ecosystem, what are the different functional aspects of an ecosystem, how an ecosystem functions, how different organisms are interdependent on each other, how different organisms interact not only with the biotic components but different abiotic components. What are the different forms in which we can represent the different organisms that are present at the different trophic levels that will be represented in the form of pyramids, which are known as pyramids of biomass, pyramid of energy, and pyramid of number. So after that, we learn about different biogeochemical cycles that involves the recycling of the nutrients with the help of both biotic and abiotic components. In that, we majorly focused on some gaseous cycles like carbon cycle, and we learned about the nitrogen cycle and phosphorus cycle. Besides this, we also had a brief discussion on water cycle. So basically, we get to know that what is the importance of an ecosystem, what is an ecology, how different organisms and populations interact with each other. Now, in today's lecture, we will learn about what is biodiversity. So we will focus on the diversity of the organisms, living organisms, as the name suggests, bio means living organisms. So we will focus on the diversity or the different types of living organisms that are present in that will be present in an ecosystem, or basically that are present in the biosphere. So let's start with some introduction. So there is the enormous diversity of the life that exists on the earth. We know that even from the starting of the existence of life is very early, and there is an enormous diversity of life that has evolved at different time points and is now present on the earth. Humans are not the only organisms that are present on this planet, and they share this planet with the rich variety of other living organisms. For example, this is just a number to show that to show or to give the idea or to present the idea about how rich our diversity is. So, for example, there are more than 20,000 species of ants, 3 lakh species of beetles, 28,000 species of fishes, and nearly 20,000 species of orchids. So these numbers itself gives an idea about the different diversity that is present even within one species or even within one kind of organism, like 20,000 species of ants. So this data suggests that there is a rich variety of the living organisms that are present on the earth. Ecologists and evolutionary biologists have been trying to understand the significance of such diversity, and basically they are trying to understand why during the course of evolution such diversity has been allowed, and what is the importance of having such a high diversity or such a diverse number of living organisms in the environment. So there are many questions that they pose. So basically, ecologists and evolutionary biologists pose some questions like why there are so many species, what is the importance of these number of species, did such great diversity exist throughout the Earth's history, or has it been evolved during the course of evolution? How did this diversification come about? Like, how did one species become diverse from the other species? How, like, how new species evolve? How and why is this diversity important to the biosphere? Is it even important to have such diverse organisms, or is it better if you have organisms of the same type? Would it function any differently if the diversity was much less? And how do humans, like ultimately the question comes to humans. So basically, how do humans benefit from the diversity of the life? So what are the benefits that diversity provides to the humans? So these are some of the questions that ecologists and evolutionary biologists usually ask about having such a great diversity in the biosphere. So the main question is that is it really necessary to have such diversity? Is it important? And if it is important, what is the functional goal of having such diverse organism? And what would happen if the diversity would have been much lesser as compared to what we see today? And what is the impact of such diversity on the human? So what is actually biodiversity? So in a biosphere, immense diversity, then diversity actually represents the heterogeneity, that is the differences that exist. These differences may not exist only at the species level, but it may exist at all the levels of the biological organization, ranging from macromolecules within the cells to biomes. So if you remember, when we were studying about the biomolecules, we studied about different biomacromolecules that are present. That may be proteins, lipids, nucleic acids. So we know that even in our species, if we will see, even in humans, the chromosomes of one organism, like we are different from each other. So there is a diversity. So there may be a difference, or there may be some changes in, there may be some genetic variation that may be present in a certain group of organisms but may not be present or may be absent in the other group. So thereby providing the heterogeneity or the diversity to the organisms that are present on this biosphere. And this diversity may or may not exist only at the species level, but may also exist at smaller levels of biological organization, ranging from macromolecules within the cells to the biomes. So biodiversity is a term which was actually popularized by the sociobiologist Edward Wilson to describe the combined diversity at all the levels of the biological organization. So to describe the combined diversity at all the different levels of the biological organization, the combined diversity of biological organization, that is for the living organisms, was defined by the term biodiversity by the sociobiologist Edward Wilson. So biodiversity is basically the short for biological diversity, and it can be considered at three main levels. So as we discussed, that diversity is not only at the species level, that Homo sapiens or humans are present, and then there is a plant, let's say Mangifera indica or mango plant. So it might be possible that the diversity may not actually exist between them. Like the diversity not only exists between the species, but also among the organisms of the same species. So if I consider, for example, some of the humans have blood group A positive, while some others have AB positive. So this is also a kind of diversity that's present within the different organisms of the same human species. So in today's lecture, we will learn about what is genetic diversity, what is species diversity, and what is an ecosystem diversity, and what is actually the importance of conserving this biodiversity that exists on this biosphere, and what are the recent some of the data that are available or are recorded in some of the international literature regarding the number of organisms that exist on the planet. So genetic diversity comprises not only the individual genetic variation within a population, but also the genetic variation between the populations that is often associated with adaptations to the local conditions. So it is not only about the individuals, genetic variation between the individuals of the same population, but the genetic variation will also exist between the populations that are often associated with adaptations to the local conditions. So, therefore, if one population becomes extinct, then a species may have lost some of the genetic diversity that makes microevolution possible. This erosion of genetic diversity in turn reduces the adaptive potential of the species, And a single species might show high diversity at the genetic level over its distributional range. So this is why genetic diversity is important, and these are the important roles due to which that is played by the genetic diversity. So microevolution is a term that has been used here. So I would like to describe microevolution in little details. So microevolution is basically the changes in the frequency of a gene within a population. So basically microevolution may be effective for is a kind of adaptation during the course of evolution that has actually allowed for the better survival. So basically, if there is a loss in the population that is having a genetic diversity, then there is a chance that there is a loss of some genetic diversity that makes the microevolution possible, thus impacting the microevolution. So basically, during the microevolution, some of the genes randomly mutated to some other genes and leading to the changes in the allele frequency over the one generation. Now, after this, there is a genetic drift, there is an inflow or outflow of the organisms from the population. So there is a genetic drift or the gene flow, and then there is a natural selection of the survival of the fittest. So therefore, genetic diversity is important, and basically, if the erosion of this genetic diversity, as mentioned, that may impact the microevolution or may reduce the adaptive potential of the species. A single species might show high diversity at the genetic level over its distributional range. So here are certain examples. For example, the genetic variation shown by the medicinal plant Rauwolfia vomitoria growing in the different Himalayan ranges might be in terms of the potency and concentration of the active chemical, which is the reserpine that the plant produces. So there might be some genetic variations that are present in these Rauwolfia vomitoria plants that grow in different ranges of the Himalayan region, and due to these genetic variation, they may differ in the potency and the concentration of the active chemical, which is the reserpine that is produced by these plants. So there might be the differences in the potency and the concentration of these active chemicals produced by these plants. And similarly, if I talk about the genetic variations within a species and try to give more examples, then we know that India has more than 50,000 genetically different strains of rice and 1,000 varieties of mangoes. So all of these arise due to the changes in the genetic, like due to variations in the genetic level. So genetic diversity is therefore important, or the genetic variations are important, as these genetic variations may actually impact the growth, survival, and the evolution of the organism. The next is the species diversity. So the diversity at the species level is known as the species diversity. So the variety of the species in an ecosystem or across the sphere defines the species diversity of any biosphere. Public awareness of the biodiversity crisis centers on the species diversity. So the major focus is on the species diversity. The major focus is to prevent the particular species, as we know that these species play a particular important role in that particular area. Therefore, it is important to preserve those species. So the public awareness program basically focuses the public awareness program of biodiversity crisis centers mainly focuses on the species diversity. That is the variety of the species or the number of the species in any ecosystem or across the biosphere. So as more species are lost to extinction, the species diversity decreases. So we know that there are certain species that have actually become extinct, or there are certain species that are on the verge of extinction. So as more and more species will be lost to extinction, the species diversity would obviously decrease. The US Endangered Species Act, that is the ESA, defines endangered species as the species that as the one that is in the danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. So there are certain animals or certain birds that have already been have become extinct, or there are certain that are on the verge of extinction. So basically, this Endangered Species Act defines so the definition of endangered species according to the ESA or the Endangered Species Act is the one in which are in the danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. Threatened, in contrast to endangered species, similar to the endangered species, there is another term which is threatened species. So threatened species are those that are considered likely to become endangered in the near future, like which are not on the verge of extinction, but they may become endangered in the near future. So their number is also less, and we need to prevent or preserve these species at any level. Otherwise, there will be a day when there will be no organism of these species left. The next type of diversity is an ecological diversity. So the ecological diversity is the variety of the biosphere's ecosystem is a third level of biological diversity. So, what are the different varieties of the biosphere ecosystem is defined by the ecological biodiversity or the diversity. Now, because of many interactions between the populations of different species in any ecosystem, then as we see in case of prey-predator relationship, or we see in case of commensalism or mutualism, like these interactions may be positive, negative, or may not have any effect on each other. But if in any case, if these interactions are impacting the growth survival of other species, then the local extinction of one species would definitely have a negative impact on other species in the ecosystem. So we know that, for example, in case of prey-predator relationship, if by any chance it happens like the predator, like the prey for the predator become extinct, then there will be a time that predators will also start decreasing in number due to starvation. So basically, the extinction of one species is not limited to the hindered growth of that particular species, but it will also result in the negative impact on the other species in the ecosystem. So for instance, if I talk about an example of birds called the flying foxes, these flying foxes are important pollinators and seed dispersers in the Pacific Islands, where they are increasingly hunted as a luxury food. Now, the conservational biologists, that is the biologists that are actually trying to study this conservational biology of conserving these ecological, these diversity or these diverse organisms, they fear that the extinction of the flying foxes would also harm the native plants of the Samoan Islands, where 4/5 of the tree species depend on the flying foxes for pollination or seed dispersal. So basically, we see that from this example, we can have an idea that how the extinction of one species can actually impact the growth of the other species within the same ecosystem. So at the ecosystem level, if I talk about it, India, for instance, with its desert, rainforest, mangroves, coral reefs, wetlands, estuaries, and alpine meadows, has a greater ecosystem diversity than a Scandinavian country like Norway. So this is just for a simple comparison that if I talk about the ecosystem at the ecosystem level, India is a very rich, diverse, great ecosystem diversity as compared to some of the countries like Scandinavian countries like Norway. So this figure actually represents the three levels of biodiversity. So the first one is the genetic biodiversity, the next is the diversity at the species level, and then we have the community and ecosystem diversity across the entire region. So basically, we can see that if I look at this figure, we can see that in a whole population, the organisms are actually having the differences at the genetic level. So you may see that the same alleles that represented the different organisms may have a variation as represented by the different colored bands in the different chromosomes of the different organisms of the same population. The next is the species diversity in a coastal redwood ecosystem where different types of species are present. The third one is the community and ecosystem diversity across the landscape of an entire region. So these are the different levels of the biodiversity, and most of the biologists talk about the diversity at the species level. Most of the awareness programs, public awareness programs are functional at the level of the species diversity and how these species diversity are actually how and what is the need to prevent this species. So actually what is the species diversity on Earth? So the record is actually maintained by IUCN. So according to IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources 2004, the total number of the plants and animal species described so far is slightly more than 1.5 million. But obviously, we have no clear idea of how many species are yet to be discovered and described. So, like every year, there is a discovery of some new species. So, therefore, till now, like in 2000, according to the IUCN 2004, the total number of the plants and animal species that were described were slightly more than 1.5 million. But obviously, this is not the end and this is not the exact figure. The number of species keep on ending after this also, and there is the extinction of some species. So, therefore, we do not have any clear idea of how many species are yet to be discovered and described. So, estimates vary widely, and many of them are only the guesses. For many taxonomic groups, species inventories are more complete in temperate than in tropical countries. Considering that an overwhelmingly large proportion of the species waiting to be discovered are in tropics, so most of the taxonomic groups that have the inventories, so most of these species they have recorded are found in the temperate region than in the tropical countries. So therefore, we may uh, think of the fact that the large population of the species is still waiting to be discovered in the tropical region, and biologists make a statistical comparison of the temperate tropical species richness of an exhaustively studied group of insects and extrapolate this ratio to other groups of animals and plants to come up with a gross estimate of the total number of species on the earth. So this estimation suggests that the species may range from the number of species may range from 20 to 15 million. But a more conservative and scientifically sound estimate was produced by Robert May, who places the global species diversity at about 7 million. So it is considered that there are around 7 million species that represent, and we have just discovered around 1.5 to 2 million species. There are a lot more species that are still need to be discovered and described. More than 70% of all the species recorded are animals, while plants including the algae, fungi, bryophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms comprises no more than 22% of the total. Also among the animals, if I'll talk about, the insects are the most species-rich taxonomic group, making them 70% of the total. That means out of every 10 animals of this planet, 7 animals are the insects. So insects forms a major portion of the animal group. The number of fungi species in the world is more than the combined total of the species of fishes, amphibians, reptiles, and so this was an estimate, and this is the figure that represents the global biodiversity. Proportionate numbers of species of major taxa of plants, invertebrates, and vertebrates. So we can see that invertebrates and vertebrates are the part of animals. So we can see that in invertebrates itself, the insects are the major group. And if I talk about the vertebrates, fishes are the major group. And if I talk about the plants, we can see that the fungi is the major group, which is more than even the, as we mentioned, that the total number of the fungal species in the world is more than the combined total of the species of fishes, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. So basically, this is the representation of the global biodiversity that is present on the earth or that exists on the earth, and still many more are still need to be discovered and described. So it should be noted that these estimates do not give us any figure, but the data which is being presented till now only represents the eukaryotes and it does not contain any data about the prokaryotes. And biologists are actually not sure about how many prokaryotic species there might be. The problem is that the conventional taxonomic methods are not suitable for identifying the microbial species, and many species are simply not culturable under the laboratory conditions. And therefore, it is actually very difficult to identify those species or to isolate and grow those species. So therefore, the data that has been described till now is only for the eukaryotes. And even if we accept the biochemical and molecular criteria for delineating the species for this group, then the diversity alone might run into the millions. We know that bacteria, the number of species of bacteria and fungi, like the prokaryotes is really high. It is difficult to identify those species because of some limitations, like all of them are not culturable under the laboratory conditions. Also, if we consider the biochemical and molecular criteria along with the culture capacity, then we will find that the organisms in the prokaryotes or the number of species in the prokaryotic group is more than the other organisms that exist in eukaryotic eukaryotes, and their diversity alone might run into the million. Although, if I talk about the land area, India is only 2.4% of the world's land area. Its share of the global diversity is very impressive at an 8.1%. That is what makes our country one of the 12 mega diversity countries of the world. And nearly 45,000 species of the plants and twice as many of animals have been recorded from India. So if we talk about the Robert May's global estimate, where basically we described that the total number of the plant and animal species may be around 7 billion. So that only 22% of the total species have been recorded so far. So we will see 1.5 million have been recorded so far. So around 22% of the total species have been recorded so far. And applying this proportion now to India's diversity figure, we may estimate that there are probably more than 1 lakh plant species and more than 3 lakh animal species yet to be discovered and described. So if we consider that only 22% of the plant and the total species have been recorded so far, therefore, if I talk about India, then there are actually lot more species that are present in India than what is described. So it has been described that nearly 45,000 species of the plants and almost twice of that of the animals have been recorded from the India. So if we accept May's global, so there is still more number of the plants and the situation seems more hopeless when we realize a large fraction of these species like already are facing the threat of the extinction or are becoming extinct even before we discover them. So there might be chances that certain species have already become extinct before we have actually described these species. So this is one of the fear that we have, that like we might not be able to discover those species in future. So considering the richness in the diversity of the organisms that are present in the world or in the entire biosphere, and even in India, we should consider the importance of conserving this biodiversity. So it has taken millions of years of evolution to accumulate this rich diversity in the nature. But we could lose all that wealth in less than 2 centuries if the present rate of species losses continue. So if the number of organisms or the number of species that are depleting in today's time, if the present rate continued like this, then we might lose all the species that are present on the earth within the less than 2 centuries. So biodiversity and its conservation are now vital environmental issues of international concern as more and more people around the world begin to realize the critical importance of biodiversity for our survival and well-being on this planet. So we know that if plants start becoming extinct, if there is no plant species, then we know that we will have to suffer. We will not get enough oxygen, we will not have purified air, we will not get oxygen, we will not get food. So therefore, we know that the extinction of one species actually bring us in danger also. Therefore, the conservationists are trying to conserve or are trying to focus on the issue of conserving this biodiversity for the survival of for our survival and the well-being of this planet. So as I described earlier also, there are two types of species, endangered species and threatened species. So endangered species are the ones that are in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And threatened species are those considered likely to become endangered in the near future. So these are just a few statistics that illustrates the problem of species loss. So according to the IUCN, 12% of the 10,000 known species of the birds and 21% of the 5,500 known species of mammals are threatened. That is, they are on the verge to become the endangered. A survey by the Center for Plant Conservation showed that nearly 20,000 known plant species in the United States, 200 have become extinct since such records have been kept, and 730 are endangered or threatened. So this is a very alarming situation where out of 20,000, almost 1,000 species are either on the verge of extinction or on the verge of threat. In North America, at least 123 freshwater animal species have become extinct since 1900 and hundreds more species are threatened. The extinction rate for North American freshwater fauna is about 5 times as higher as that for the terrestrial animals. These are some of the alarming facts or the figures that actually represents the need, the immediate need to conserve the biodiversity. As we know that the biodiversity is interdependent on each other, and as we know that the biodiversity is highly dependent. So these are some of the alarming facts that suggest that why there is a need for the extinction of the, like why there is a need to prevent the extinction of the biodiversity conservation to prevent the extinction of species. So extinction of a species may also be local. For example, a species may be lost in one river system but survive in an adjacent one. So there might be a local extinction or the extinction may be global extinction. So the global extinction of a species means that it has lost from all the ecosystem in which it lived, leaving them permanently impoverished. So therefore, it is really important to conserve these species. And in the next lectures, we will learn about how these species diversity work and what is the functional role of these species diversity and what are the different methods for the conservation of these species diversity. So with this, I would like to thank you all for attending today's lecture on the biodiversity and hope to see you all in the next lecture.